Welcome to Not So Distant Dreaming with the Marcocks. I'm your host, Zach, and today we have Carter, Gus, Liam, and on the line we have Garrett. Gus, he has these really vivid dreams, and it's really cool to hear because these can go on for a long time. What do you have to say about these dreams, Liam?
Well, normally, somebody dreams about something one night and wakes up and goes to sleep again and dreams about a completely different thing. And now this is partially true with Gus, but his dreams, the next dreams have connections. They're all interconnected, and it's really, really interesting to think about.
All right, that's totally true. Yeah. What was your first thought when you heard about these dreams, Carter?
I was kind of surprised that he could memorize these for a very long time, and it was just kind of impressive on how long these dreams can go.
Yeah. And what do you think, Garrett?
Well, I was really impressed. I always have very stupid dreams, never connected, but when I sat there and I heard these dreams that were all connected and he knew them in such detail, I was just blown away. I thought it was very interesting.
It really is.
And yeah, I agree with what you guys said.
Yeah, it's really kind of pretty cool. Do you have anything to say about it, Gus?
Yeah, well, before about a year and a half ago, I always just had what I thought was really standard dreams, just, drowning, falling, or just some weird crap. But about a year and a half ago, I started to have these dreams that I could just remember in just vivid detail when I woke up. And after a few of them, I started to notice that they were all kind of taking place in the same continuity. And I just thought the best thing to do is just kind of write them down in my phone so I could remember them. And I just started doing that. And the writer in me really wanted to do something with them. So I started talking about them with my friends, and they said we should do a podcast.
Yeah, and then that's how this has begun. So hopefully we can get about a dream in an episode, maybe half a dream, because some of them get really long, and it should be pretty good.
Fair warning, they're very, very weird. They're all kind of sci-fi, sort of. It takes place kind of in a dystopic future, and it took me a little bit to figure out really that it was still Earth, but yeah, it kind of starts off in modern day, and then it just goes from there. Hope you guys enjoy. Start with the first one here.
This one was pretty integral to the plot. I think we can begin.
James stood outside his door for a moment and took in a deep breath of air. He held it in his lungs for a while and slowly let it trickle out through his nose. He looked around for a moment and set off towards high school. James lived on the outskirts of the tiny Grable, Wyoming, which was way past its prime. He started off with the September sun just breaking over the horizon. The sunrise cast hues of orange on the calf-high grass and dull shades of yellow that were beautiful in its own rustic way. It swayed with the kiss of the warm breezes from the west, giving it the appearance of falling down and leaning back up, only to fall with the next gust. The sound of it brushing against itself gave off a sound similar to water in a small river. In the distance, James could make out the silhouettes of wild antelope bounding across the horizon. James had just begun to lose himself in these sights and sounds when he was hit hard and fell harder. His face hit the unpaved dirt road beneath him, and he felt weight on his back. Then he heard laughter. The weight shifted off, and when James moved onto his knees, he saw Nico overcome with laughter on the ground next to him. "Oh, crap, man, I got you." Nico was barely able to get the words out between fits of laughter. James might have been mad, but it was hard to get mad at anything when Nico was in the area. "Yeah, you got me," said James, allowing himself a small chuckle. He looked down, a wide grin crossing his face to brush off his shirt. He looked over at Nico, still lying on his back, nearly hysterical in his ecstasy. Nico and James looked nothing alike. Nico was tan and James was not. Nico had eyes and hair like milk chocolate that laid flat against his head, and James had lighter brown hair that stood up in front no matter what he did with it. His eyes were striking blue, almost as light as the sky at noon. The two best friends looked almost nothing alike, but they shared a smile. They both had wide Cheshire grins that were infectious in nature. James shifted his gaze forward and saw another smile approaching. Anna came towards them, her wise, knowing, but playful smirk adorned upon her lips. She shook her head as she drew near and drew out a sigh as she shuffled to stop in front of them. She opened her mouth to speak, but had to quickly drop her head to hide her soft chuckle. She motioned to both of them to get up, and the three started off. Even though they were only 15, James found himself with Anna and Nico in classes with the seniors. James sat in the back, as he didn't find any need within himself to draw the attention of his peers. Anna seemed to share this value. Nico did not, and he didn't have to. He was quite impulsive and made no attempt to hide it. Despite the best efforts of teachers throughout the years, Nico chimed in frequently, with or without his teacher's permission, often to relate some short anecdote or wisecrack. The upperclassmen adored him. Anna and James were content with relative invisibility in the classroom. Neither one of them sought more attention than they already had, not to say that they weren't introverted or involved. Anna was a very successful runner, participating in both track and cross-country. James, not sharing her athletic aptitude, belonged to the debate team. But in the end, they preferred to keeping to themselves for the most part. The day passed without event, and after completing their remaining homework, the trio headed to their favorite place in Grable, the fairly new pizzeria with an arcade. But leaving this small school, none of them noticed the white van waiting on the street corner, standing silent sentry, like a predator slinking around, waiting to strike. You couldn't call any of them gamers, and it is generous to refer to the corner of the restaurant with only 3 machines and arcade, but considering how small the town was, entertainment options were limited. Over the course of the past year since it had opened, James had mastered Galaga. Despite the frantic pace of the game, it always seemed to calm him down. And so they stayed for an hour or two before Anna declared it time to leave, and so they headed out into the night. No one talked as they had begun the 2-mile trek. The night seemed to be watching them, with silent eyes that were tucked out of sight, not seen, but felt. James felt goosebumps rising on his arms and his brow furrowed. He had a deep knot in his stomach, and he tried to remember if he had forgotten something. He thought harder, searching his subconscious for what was causing this sudden anxiety. Nico, usually so lively, seemed to share this grave demeanor. Nico seemed to become self-aware of this and offered a weak attempt at humor. Neither James nor Anna paid much attention, and the dynamic silence returned. Nico stopped dead in his tracks. James turned to see his friend's eyes roll back as his knees buckled. He hit the ground, and James noticed something metallic sticking out of his back. Anna screamed. James looked past Nico and saw a white van parked not 20 feet behind them, and a man walking toward them. He was older, maybe around 65, with white slick-back hair, dark, wide-rimmed glasses, and a perfectly blank expression. In his hand, he held a sleek silver gun of some sort. "Run!" Anna screamed as she grabbed James's arm. James took off with her, struggling to keep up with Anna as she dragged him along. He stumbled on something and looked back. The man had broken into a run, but was falling behind. James regained his balance, but just as he hit his stride, Anna let out a gasp. She collapsed, her flailing leg clipping James's foot. James rolled over once and saw the man still running at them. He scrambled up and grasped Anna's limp leg at the ankle and began dragging her, backpedaling as quickly as he could. The initial shock had worn off, and James was screaming out of fear and effort as he mustered every bit of strength he could. He suddenly felt a violent stinging impact in his leg and saw a dart sticking out of his thigh. He felt his muscles relax, and everything was dark before he hit the ground. Consciousness returned slowly to James. He was tired and sore. Everything he felt and saw mixed together into one blur in which he couldn't get a coherent thought together. He slowly became aware of his surroundings, and his head cleared up, like clouds being blown away from the sun. He was elevated off the ground about 6 inches. His feet and hands were strapped down to a metal sheet behind him. He was upright, but reclined about 15 degrees. An IV was inserted into his lower arm, and the tube twisted once and disappeared behind the metal sheet. He seemed to be in a glass box, and beyond the walls were 2 more, one with Nico and the other with Anna. The boxes were facing each other. They were in a white room, about 30 feet by 30 feet, with 2 remarkable features. Both were on the wall to James's left, to the right of Anna, and directly in front of Nico, but opposite of his box. There was a white metal door, and above it a clock, but this clock did not tell conventional time. The clock currently read 1, 17, 12, 13. The 13 changed to 14, then 15, and so forth, and James could only assume the clock functioned as a kind of stopwatch. After a few moments, James found himself noticing his friends were not awake. Sudden panic began to envelop him. His breathing and heart rate increased, and he felt a pounding in his stomach as confusion and anger surrounded his thoughts. His gaze rose to the clock. It was 1:17:20. He felt a strange sensation, then looked down at his forearm. A yellow liquid was pumping into it from the IV. "No," he cried. "No, no, no!" Thrashing in vain as he began to feel weak and his eyelids began to slide downwards. Within seconds, he blacked out again. James snapped awake, jerking his head from side to side to find he was in the same spot. He raised his eyes to the clock. 4, 23, 59, 48. Nico and Anna were still in their respective boxes, dead for all James knew. Then the clock hit 5, and the door clicked open. Into the white room stepped in the man. James bounced his knee rapidly as he stared at the textbook. AP Calculus, it read. He needed to reread it, but was too nervous to comprehend any of it. Dr. Eldwine said nerves should be expected. He said they were necessary when it came to the tests. Nerves might have been necessary, but the profound exhaustion James felt probably wasn't. James looked up at the large clock on the wall of his room. 1:98, 22, 22, 21. He had less than 26 hours until the test. He looked around the rest of the room. It was small, about 15 feet by 7 feet. The opposite side him contained a thin mattress and a pillow. On the adjacent side there was a desk with a lamp, where he currently was, as the lamp was needed to read, being the only source of light in the room. There was also a bookcase and sink. Just thinking about the confines made James feel restless. He stood and strided briskly to the other side of the room. He looked back at the desk and drew in a deep breath. Each of them got 3 hours of recreation time on alternating days. During this time, the individual whose day it was got their door unlocked. They had their run of the facility and could choose whether or not to unlock the doors of the other two. A pact had been made to always let the others out unless they did not want to be let out. However, Anna always refused to let the boys out during the eve of a test, as she said they needed to study. Today was Anna's day. There would be no recreation time the day after tomorrow, however, as the test took exactly 24 hours to complete. The tests were administered in small white rooms, which contained one fluorescent light, one folding chair, one bucket, and one white desk in which an electronic tablet was built in. The questions would keep coming on, and the electronic tablets made into the desks until one full day had passed. No food, no water, no leaving until Eldwine let them out. Failing the test was constituted by not answering at least 250 questions or getting below a 90% accuracy score. Failing scared all three of them. The tests were intensive and covered any material Eldwine had taught them in the small classroom within the facility, which is also where they took their meals, which was comprised of nothing but a small portion of white, tasteless slop. The facility also contained a large hall where they were made to run laps, do sit-ups, push-ups, and every other exercise imaginable for hours on end. The hall and classroom were blank as the testing rooms and just as sparsely decorated. The only bit of color was a single black door just down the hall from the testing rooms. They never saw it was outside the door, thanks to Eldwine's threat of having a small bomb implanted in their shoulders go off. Every day for the past 197 days, their surroundings stayed the same, as did their daily routine. 0100 to 0600, sleep. 0600 to 0610, meal 1. 610 to 1700, academics. 1700 to 1900, athletics. 1900 to 1910, meal 2. 1910 to 2300, independent study. 2300 to 0, recreation. Despite the monotony and general blandness of their schedule and surroundings for the past months, it was not to say that James was uninterested. James had decided interested was not the right word for it. He survived in a constant state of sheer terror. Eldwine was not hard to fear. The man never once showed any sign of emotion. His voice always held the same tone. He didn't even seem to blink. This man was so consistently unyielding in his demeanor, the element of predictability present nearly drove James to madness, wondering if the exterior of Eldwine would crack, and what the man inside the shell really was, if there was a man. James often found himself looking deep into the man's dull gray eyes, looking for any sign of life. He never saw any. James knew the man would feel no remorse should he tap the buttons on his wrist and end the lives of his prisoners at any moment by blowing the bombs in their bodies. And James didn't have the slightest clue as to what that moment would be. No rules had ever been given to them since their arrival, and none need have been given, and that watch ensured so. But it wasn't that the watch that moved James back to his studies that night. What moved him was the thought of what those eyes might look like when the button was pressed. Day 922. James's gaze pierced the ceiling, his chest slowly rising and falling. His calm appearance hid the turmoil of emotions and thoughts fighting beneath the surface of his skin. He closed his eyes and returned to what had happened earlier. Eldwine had led them through the athletics hall, where James could now run sprints 40 yards in 3.5 seconds, Nico in 3.3, and Anna in 3 flat, and could bench 300, 550, and 720 pounds respectively, to a hidden door they had never seen before. Behind the door was the room James recognized as being where they had first been taken. Everything was exactly the same as it had been nearly 3 years ago. The glass boxes were in the same formations, as was the equipment inside each one. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing except the boy out like a light in the nearest box. Eldwine said nothing of it. Anna and Nico had blank expressions, as did James. The silence stood for several minutes before Eldwine spoke. Greg. And so James lay, turning the name over and over in his head. Then he sat up slowly. Gripping the edge of his bed, a sheer determination rose within him. He stood and walked out of his room after ripping apart the lamp cord. Clutching the lamp in one hand, his gait sped up as he reached the athletics hall. He went through the hidden door and saw Greg. He was awake, and his eyes were open and wild with fear. It was obvious he had been crying. James put a finger to his lips and approached the glass. He turned his head away and closed his eyes and signaled for Greg to do the same. James lifted the lamp and smashed it through the glass, which shattered the face of the box. James felt his heart thudding against the front of his chest as he ran through the hall towards the big black door. James's hope that the door led out of this place had been trapped in. Grasping Greg's arm, he pulled him towards what he hoped was salvation. James then felt his gut turn awfully, as though his insides were going to become his outsides. He stopped before the door and turned. Eldwine stood at the end of the hall, eyes unblinking, trained on the pair. James felt his eyes widen and breath deepen considerably as he noticed the finger hovering over the wrist. Then the tip fell upon the button. The confined hall amplified the noise to an incredible magnitude, not only deafening but disorienting James. After a moment, he noticed the warm substance covering his side. As he fell against a wall, he saw Greg. His small figure was unrecognizable where it had been blown apart. James's vision became a field of red as the blood ran down his face, and his mind went numb with shock.
So, let me just, first off, let me just say that this is all your dream. This isn't a book that you wrote. This is a dream that you actually had and then turned into a book almost word for word.
Yeah, I never really had that much of a memory of my dreams until I started having these ones that were all kind of taking place in the same world, and it would just, I'd wake up in the morning and just have this vivid remembrance of what it was, and I just had to write it down, and yeah.
Yeah. We can all see that they're just how detailed they are, and it's quite incredible that you actually had these dreams and remembered them this exactly.
One of the interesting things is it reads like a book. It reads
Yeah.
like a book, but the plot isn't like a book in that it slowly leads to a climax. There's these sudden jumps to like a certain point in action. And I find that really interesting because, it went from a regular schedule where you're doing calculus and it jumps to 922 days later. And that's kind of a thing that I imagine happens in dreams.
Yeah.
And there were some parts of the dream that I left out just because they were particularly just very strange, and I don't understand how they would fit in. Now it's just me trying to preserve what I thought of the artistic integrity of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing I think that's interesting about the dreams is all these emotions you feel about the dreams. I mean, these emotions that are just striking from these events that just appear. I just think it's very fascinating.
So I think my dreams, when I have these dreams of this continuity in my head, they all happen when I'm very emotional, and I think my emotions kind of implant themselves into my dreams and let me live in this world, but only when I'm feeling very emotional for that day.
It's really amazing. Like, if you didn't know that this was a dream, you would assume that this is a story that you wrote completely conscious because of how well it flows.
Well, what happens is when I'm asleep, obviously, I think it's weird. I know I'm not me, but I feel like it's real and that I'm living someone else's life.
Which, literally, in this dream, you're watching this from a third person view, and in your dream, you weren't James.
I was James.
Oh, you were
in my
James.
dream. I was James, and I knew I was James. But it's very strange.
You just had that feeling that you were James.
I knew I was James. Like, the logic of my dream made sense to me in that moment.
Yeah, your brain
Yes.
tells you it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's very similar to a book because the way that you narrate it makes you it makes you think that you're James, or you can kind of understand where James is coming from, but it's a third person narrator, right? So the weirdest part is that the fact that you're James but decided to write as a third person narrator.
So why I wanted to make it like that in the third person is, personally, I have no clue what emotions are triggering this, so kind of for me to step back and write it from a third person, I can understand my subconscious from an outside perspective.
Okay, gotcha.
It's almost like this allows us to live your dream.
Mm-hmm.
It's really cool.
But I had a question about the days. You said you said you were like in there for 900 days. Did you kind of live through all those days, or was it just kind of jumping?
In my dream, it was really weird. It was kind of like when you press the fast forward button on a television, and you can kind of see just all these images flash by, and then when you're in day 992, it doesn't feel like you've jumped. It feels like all that time has passed, but you know that it's kind of skipped. I just didn't think that would make a whole lot of sense to...
Your brain
Yeah,
tells
writing-
you
yeah.
that you're at 922.
Yeah.
Writing that doesn't do it justice.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course with the clock, because the clock was telling them days, hours, minutes, seconds. And I in my dream I knew where the clock was. I didn't remember the exact day of the clock, but writing it down I knew it was about 3 years. And also I was aging in my dream, as were my peers. We've all aged from 15 to now close to 17 or 18.
And in your dream, like, you actually thought of the names Nico and Anna, right?
Yeah, Nico, Anna, and James, those were all the names of the character in my dreams.
And-
Eldwine was also the name of the character.
And you don't know any kids, you're not friends with a Nico, Anna, or James at school, so these names just were put into your head for whatever reason.
Yeah, I don't know. My brain does some pretty weird stuff. All right, you guys ready for the second part of it?
I think
we
so.
All right.
Yeah, ready.
Let's get back into it.
James snapped his eyes open. He was back on the metal table. The glass box was gone. Eldwine stood in front of him. Everything felt unreal, like James was trapped in a nightmare, but his senses and wit remained sharp. "Why am I alive?" he asked Eldwine. "Because you intrigue me, James. You may not have the, physical gifts of your peers, but your mental state, extraordinary, simply marvelous. I do suppose you have come to wonder after all this time why you're here, what has happened to you." As he spoke, Eldwine opened a box on the table behind James. He pulled out a long syringe filled with a clear liquid. "Inside all of us, James, there's no extraordinary genome, and within a select few, there's a particularly exciting genome. Nico, Anna, and yourself has such a genetic complexion. I've seen as far back as your test grades from your primary years, your blood samples at the doctor's. I've known for a while. I've known because of my sources." Eldwine stuck the needle in James's leg. "At any rate, Greg was more expendable than yourself. But I'm disappointed. There will be repercussions." Eldwine produced a scalpel from the box. James dragged himself down the hall towards his room. His lower body burned. He pulled himself to Anna's door and pounded on it. It was opened, and Nico stood there. He furrowed his brow as he looked forward, then downward to James. His expression turned to pure shock. He stumbled back into the room, and a crash came from wherever he fell. James saw Anna sitting on her bedside. She rose and came toward James. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she silently picked him up and carried him into his room. She opened the door to the lightless space and laid him on the bed. He heard Nico yelling and pounding on the wall. As she rose to leave, James sat up and pulled his head close to his. "Get us out of here," he whispered into her ear. She nodded and turned to leave. As she closed the door, the light leaving gave just enough for James to see the bandages soaking with blood just above his knees, where his legs had been removed. "Are you sure of this?" Nico murmured. "Am I sure it's going to work?" "No." "Am I sure I want to do it?" "Of course," James responded. He turned to Anna, who stood to his left, feeling his bare shoulder. She stopped, pressed her fingers up against him, and nodded. In the other hand, she held the wire James had ripped the lamp from, which was still live. James closed his eyes and took in a deep breath, then nodded. He winced as the metal pierced his skin. The electricity tingled, then stung. He felt a sudden jolt, and the wire was removed. "Did it work?" Anna asked. Anna shrugged in response, then pulled down her shirt to expose her shoulder. James clung to Anna, his arms wrapped around her shoulder, and shut his eyes as they burst into the night air. The smell of pine surrounded them, and James was outside for the first time in 3 years. Ahead of them was a mountain range, and the terrain that currently ran down on was rocky woodland. They were in the mountains. They had no trouble seeing in the night as the stars were clear, bright, and plentiful. The cool air never smelled so good to James, who smiled as Anna ran down the slope. He turned back and saw Eldwine push a button on his wrist. When nothing happened, James let out a laugh. As Anna and Nico sprinted down the mountain to freedom, James howled into the night. Eldwine turned back into the door. Down the hall he strided. Several moments later, he came to a dimly lit space with 3 monitors on the wall and a large console in front of them. He flipped a switch and it came to life, illuminating and humming quietly. The monitors also activated, and for a while they were white screens. Eldwine waited for several minutes, and then the image changed. Each monitor filled with a silhouette, and sound came from the middle one, a voice distorted by some effect. "Doctor," the deep, ominous voice chortled. "How goes it?" "Subjects C, D, and E have left this facility prematurely by their own means," said Eldwine. Another monitor joined in. "How disheartening, Doctor. You know what rides on this, especially with James." The third one spoke, a deeper tone than either of its counterparts. "It is time, then, to enact the Fimbulwinter." At hearing this, Eldwine dropped his head and stood silently for a long time. "Very well," he said. James wore Rocky's ball cap and faded denim jacket. Nico and Anna, who sat across the aisle from him, were dressed similarly. They were riding the public bus back to the cheap motel they had been staying for the past several weeks. The Denver Rooms for Cheap, and cheap it was. For $25 a night, they got 2 rooms, each with a queen bed and one with a pull-out couch. They collected their daily fee, as well as food money, by winning in chess in various parks against hustlers. The bus ride was quiet tonight, however, as one of their opponents had not taken to kindly losing to Nico, who was taken a switchblade to the face as a result. Of course, Nico could have easily broken the guy's skull with a single punch, but better not to attract attention. Nico thought they should get legitimate jobs or enroll in school or even go home, but James and Anna shot this down, explaining that Eldwine had found them once and he would find them again if they were too conspicuous. The bus slowed down at the stop near the motel and the trio exited, James riding on Nico's back. When they entered the room, James was exhausted enough to be asleep on the bed without bothering to take his clothes off. Anna and Nico trudged into the next room, where Anna tore a strip of the bedding off to wrap Nico's wound with. "I'm worried about James," Nico remarked as she worked. "He barely talks. He scarcely eats. He's too damn worried about Eldwine. He's not going to find us." Anna let out a sigh. "We don't know who he's connected to. It's too risky to not lie low," she said. Nico pulled her hand away from him. "He took our lives from us. I just want that back. Something normal. I want to, live," said Nico. "But he took that from me. Ever since he took us, I can't. Nico suddenly broke into tears. Anna slowly shook her head and finished for him. "You can't feel?" "I know. He took everything. I can't feel anything either. Not joy, sadness, grief for the family I left. He took everything. But he left one thing," Anna said as she lifted Nico's head. Nico studied her eyes for a moment. The eyes of his friend he had seen true horror with. The eyes that had held the same fear he did for years, locked away in a mountain. "What," he asked, "could he have possibly left us?" "Each other," she answered. She came toward him and pressed her lips on his, and they fell back onto the bed together. Eldwine sat in the corner booth of a dark bar, a beer in front of him which he stared at blankly. The place was empty except for Eldwine, and silent except for the bartender yelling on the phone in the back. In the door came a man and a woman, both no older than 25. The man was dark, with his long, greasy black hair pulled back into a bun. His lip piercing shook as he pulled his mouth into a smirk. The woman behind him wore a scowl in her fair complexion, and her bright pink hair was in a pixie cut. They moved to where Eldwine sat and slid into the booth across from Eldwine. The man spoke. "Well, Doc, long time no see." The woman slammed the table. "What the hell, Eldwine? You nearly blow our cover and still expect us to finish your mission?" "A, B," Eldwine addressed them. "Pleasure. Forget your previous assignment. Something more pressing has to be dealt with. You know the newest 3. They're somewhere in the city. Find them. Bring James to the airfield. I don't care about the other 2. Then get yourselves to the plateau," said Eldwine. The woman's eyes widened, and the man kept his head down. Slowly they stood up and left. Trembling, Eldwine brought the bottle to his lips and took a long swig. "Mom, I'm okay. I don't know if you've forgotten about me or if you're even still in Grable. I'm with Anna and Nico. I can't say what happened, and I can't say where we are. I'm alive and well, and we're not being held against our will. You cannot try to find me. It's too dangerous. But know that I will do all I can to see you again. Enclosed are letters from Anna and Nico to their folks as well. More than anything, know that I love you and always will. James." Nico held the letter in an envelope with no return address as he entered the post office. He glanced at the bulletin board in the lobby, but did a double take. In the center were 3 wanted posters with pictures from years ago of James, Anna, and himself. He looked around him, pulled the cap lower over his eyes, and left the building. Anna paced back and forth across the room, her hands running anxiously through her hair. "You're sure it was us?" James asked sharply. "Positive," said Nico. "And what did it say again?" asked Anna. "Wanted for questioning by the state of Colorado and the FBI," Nico recalled. James put his head in his hands. "Jesus," he moaned. Anna stopped and turned toward them. "We have to get out of the country," she said quietly. James began nodding while Nico stared out the window. James clung to Anna's back, who stood on the platform, his heart pounding. They had just enough money for 3 tickets to El Paso via train. He knew they were being followed by 2 persons, a young man and woman, who currently stood 20 feet behind them. He knew Anna, and Nico knew too. The train slowly pulled in, and they entered its doors. The pair also slipped on an entrance towards the front of the car. The door slid shut, and the train lurched forward with a deep groan as it pulled out of the station. Several hours passed uneasily for James, who never dared to glance back. But then at once his nerve overtook him. He turned to peer over his shoulder and saw the pair staring back at him. He moved his head around and leaned toward Anna. "We need to get off this train," he murmured. "Now." Anna nodded at this and slowly stood up. Nico lifted his gaze and seemed to understand. He rose slowly and followed Anna, James on her back. James turned his head and saw the man and woman casually stepping into the aisle. Anna headed for the back of the car, which ended with a door that opened up to the outside, rushing outward. Anna opened the door, and then the air hit them with a sudden blast of power. They continued outside and shut the door. Through the window, they saw the man and woman coming toward them intently, their eyes glaring. The train began to slow, and a cry came up from the passengers at the commotion. "Up," Nico cried. "Go, up, now!" Anna pulled herself onto the roof just as the man burst through the door. Nico swung wildly at him, but the man easily ducked it and struck Nico in the face. Nico stumbled backward, nose broken and bloody. The train came to a final halt, and screams came from the car. The woman grabbed a handful of his shirt and tossed him like a rag onto the roof. "Nico!" Anna screamed. James slid off her back as she ran towards the battered Nico. The woman was now on the roof of the car, and the man pulled himself up behind her. Anna ran toward them, rage in her eyes. Anna pivoted onto one foot as her legs swung around towards the woman's head. Without flinching, the woman brought her hand up to catch it. Twisting her wrist, she threw Anna off balance and several meters across the roof before she slid to a rest in front of James. They began walking down the length of the car, right towards James. James heard a rumbling and eyed the land to the side of the train. Several large black military-looking vehicles headed in their direction. Nico rose onto one knee and cocked his arm to strike. Before he could, a powerful kick from the man sprawled him back out. The woman grabbed him and pulled Nico onto his knees. The man stepped in front of James and pulled a dazed Anna to her feet and beat her over the head with his fist, letting her fall back to the train top. He crouched down over her, producing a long knife from his coat. "Hey!" a voice yelled out. The train security officer came towards them, taser gun in hand. In one instant, the man's hand snapped forward, and the next moment, the knife was through the guard's throat. The man pulled Anna to her feet and wrapped an elbow around her throat. The woman lifted Nico by his hair and placed her hands on his chin and the back of his neck. Nico was cut off by the crunch of his neck. He crumpled to the roof, and Anna screamed. The man turned her around, ready to do the same. James saw the Jeep closing in on the train. Through the windshield, he saw Eldwine in the passenger seat. James placed his hands against the edge of the car and threw himself forward. He turned in the air and saw the man diving after him. Anna stumbled back and off the train. He shattered the glass of the Jeep, and blackness engulfed him. James slowly slid open his eyes. He was lying down on a padded table, an IV in his arm. He yanked it out and rolled off the table. Searing pain shot through him as he hit the ground. He screamed in agony. His hand slid down his back to find the flesh slashed to pieces. He gasped for air, and pain coursed through him, throbbing in waves of torment. A door slid open. Eldwine stood in the frame, hands folded behind his back. "Come," he said after a short silence, and turned away. James crawled after him, gasping for air as the pain tore through his body. Down a hall they went, turning one corner, then another. James saw a small window and peered outward. No way. No. It can't be, he thought. Eldwine pressed a button and an elevator door opened. He stepped in and James drug himself in beside him. Eldwine opened his mouth to scream, but James began yelling. "You son of a bitch! You killed Nico! You sent them! You took us! I hate you, you bastard!" James spat. Eldwine closed his eyes and took in a deep breath. "If it consoles you, she got away." Nico is unnecessary. That is why I sent Ahmed and Naomi. Nico is a failure. They were too, to a certain extent. Anna was interesting. But you, James, you are an extraordinary success. You are the next phase of humanity. Humanity has been dormant for too long. You are our last hope, James. Realize it, like it or not, you will come onto the earth as its savior when the time is right. It is time to wipe clean the slate and see if we can't become better or perish. The elevator door slid open. There was a large, dark room, entirely made of grass. James crawled out and marveled at the sight before him. Stars twinkled in all directions, and the earth lay in space, lonely and desolate against the blackness. The green and blue color of it was cool and powerful. Then red and orange flashed across it. And again, then the surface was alive with marks of fire appearing. James sat stunned, and then he screamed a long, tortured bellow. Eldwine looked out as the doors shut, and the corner of his lips pulled into the faintest shadow of a grin.
Wow.
That is really powerful.
So,
Incredibly detailed.
yeah. So that really, it like not only is it an incredible story and dream, but it really makes you wonder what is going to happen.
Well, you guys like what we're doing so far, let us know, and we'll keep going with the story.
Although I do have some questions. Like you said,
Same.
you
I
said
have a
in
couple questions about the story as well.
you said in one part that Anna and Nico didn't feel any emotion, and earlier in the story, you said that Eldwine didn't feel any either. Is it possible that Eldwine underwent the same rigorous experiments?
So, what I was kind of thinking of and what kind of happened is Eldwine has this vision in his head that he's trying to make humanity better, and he was experimenting on Anna, Nico, and James. And he believes that he can make them better, and he believes this is his duty, and he purges himself of emotion to just let him fulfill his purpose. And it isn't so much, he didn't go through it, I don't think, but James, Anna, and Nico, it was just the psychological torment of what they went through that took away their emotion to
Wow.
a certain extent. But obviously they still loved each other and came to love each other through the shared trauma.
Yeah. And then at the end, when Eldwine says that James will be the savior of humanity, is it possible that Eldwine was actually doing this for a good cause and just not doing it in a good way?
Well, one of my strongest beliefs is that any cause looks good from the inside. So Eldwine truly believes he's doing the right thing, even though if him and his associates, so to speak, believe that blowing up the earth and starting again is the right thing, most of us would think of that as just some terrible event, but to them that's the right course of action.
Yeah.
I had the question of, what time do you think this was set in? Because it kind of sounded like it was set in, like, the day in where we are, like 2000s. But when do you think this was set?
So I think right now the story took place, I think when it started, it was around 2017 to 2018 when they were still living in Grable, and about the time it ended, it was around 2020 or 2021.
Is there any connection to Grable, Wyoming? Like, did you ever been there?
Yeah,
Have
my,
you lived there?
A lot of my family is from the northwest of Wyoming, and I absolutely love the area. My grandparents lived in Basin for a long time, which is kind of a sister city to Grable, and I really loved the town of Grable and Basin, and I just thought Grable would be a spectacular setting.
And is this kind of the setting that you dreamed, or you weren't sure entirely where it was, but you decided that's where in the world it was?
I knew it was somewhere in the Rocky Mountains,
Okay.
and I just decided Grable would be a good starting point because the facility Eldwine has them is obviously close to Denver because that's where they end up. So it's somewhere in either the southern Wyoming part of the Rockies or the northern Colorado part of the Rockies where the facility that Eldwine has was. And if you guys like this and want some more, you will definitely see more of that area and other places in that area.
I know a little bit about how they connect, and I could see it during that, and that story really does pair together everything into one, and I can't wait to see the next connection.
So some of my stories, some of them are kind of part of this main continuity, and the one I did was that, and then there are others that are kind of spin-offs, so to say, of it, but they all take place within the same world.
Yeah, it's just one of those details that is hard to get down because your brain just gives you a feeling of it, but you don't really know exactly where you are.
Yeah, it usually takes me a few minutes once I wake up to kind of process what's happened.
I had one final question for you. How did this dream change you? How did it make you feel afterwards? Did you think differently?
So, kind of, yeah, because for me, it was really a terrifying dream to have.
No doubt.
Because who I was being taken away from his family, who we don't really see until he writes the letter to his mother. So we don't really know a whole lot about his family, but he's taken away from his family, and I kind of, experienced this in my own way, dreaming it. But I woke up and I was, just utterly terrified that I was still being pursued or chased, or that I was watching the whole world that I knew being blown to oblivion. And it just was a terrifying. That was the worst part for me, and it was a conscious effort that I made in my dream to scream at the end. So if there's any confusion, I understand how there might be. Eldwine took James out on a space station, so to say, so they could survive the initial extinction event that they initiated. And this was one of the most vivid images I've ever had. James sitting there in that room, watching just the world be blown up, and you feel like it's kind of your fault, and it's for your existence that happened. But he ended up being captured because he thought that this move to try to kill Elwine might distract them long enough so Anna could get away.
Yeah, it's intriguing.
Yeah, and all three of them have a really deep friendship and a really deep connection with each other after all that they've gone through, and it's very platonic between James and Anna, but Anna and Nico kind of definitely fell in love romantically.
Now, this is somewhat of a personal question, but were you, going through anything when you dreamed this?
I kind of was. It wasn't really too bad, but I was having a lot of uncertainty at this point in my own life, and I think I just wasn't sure what was going to happen next, and I think this was one of the first dreams I had in this continuity sort of world, and I think it was just kind of the whole being taken away thing was me being taken away from myself and what I was used to when I was going through this time of kind of, I didn't know what was going to happen.
I also noticed that for some reason when you dreamed this, you didn't do the normal plot where the protagonist gets the love interest and is the greatest of all the different test subjects. In this story, James's legs were cut off, so he was handicapped, and the other two people ended up falling in love, and James was also the weakest of the three. So it's kind of weird that even though he was the most important to Eldwine, he didn't have the normal protagonist characteristics in the story.
Well, yeah, I mean, the protagonist that we always see in movies and books isn't realistic at all. We all have
definitely.
Yeah, we all have emotional struggles, and I think that's a representation of it, that who we see as the good guy isn't perfect and is never going to be in reality.
Ain't gonna have the perfect story too. Ain't gonna always fall in love.
Yeah, but this isn't the last of James. There's definitely more of him.
Yeah, it's almost
I can't wait to hear more.
It's almost like the reading a story from the perspective of the third wheel in those kinds of movies and stuff,
Yeah.
It almost is like that, and of course it's a lot more dark than that, but it's kind of what I imagine it would be like if you were in a movie and you were the third wheel.
All right, well, this has been Distant Dreaming with the Marcocks.
Please call us with any interesting dreams that you may have, so we can talk about it, perhaps.
At the end or in the middle of our episodes.
Yeah.
Let us know if you want to hear more of what we're got going so far. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, remember to call us if you understand how to
Interpret dreams, because I probably need some help.
We need a psychologist.